I knew something was wrong the moment I heard her laugh. It floated down the hallway of my house. Soft, light, familiar in a way that made my hand tighten around the edge of the kitchen counter. The soup on the stove bubbled gently, releasing the smell of onions and bay leaves, but my body stopped responding to the present. At 71, you learn to recognize the difference between imagination and memory. And that sound didn't belong to my imagination. It belonged to a life I thought I'd buried. Before I go any further, let me ask you, where are you watching this from today? And if you've ever had a moment when your past showed up without warning, stay with me. You might understand more than you expect. My son, Andrew, had told me he was bringing his fiancée over for dinner. He said it casually on the phone, but I heard the careful excitement underneath. The kind that comes when a child hopes their world will finally fit together neatly. I want you to like her, he'd said. I already do, I replied, because mothers say things like that before they know better. I set the table slowly, smoothing the cloth, aligning the forks the way I always had. I chose my good sweater, the soft gray one that still made me feel like myself instead of someone's mother. I wanted to look welcoming, steady, safe. Then I heard the laugh again, closer this time, followed by Andrew's voice. Mom, we're here. When I stepped into the living room, I saw her from the side first. She stood near the window, the afternoon light catching the edges of her hair. She turned when she saw me, smiling wide, eyes bright. Mrs. Calder, she said warmly. I'm Lily. Her voice settled into me like a key turning in a lock. I smiled back because 40 years of survival had taught me how. Please, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. Call me Margaret. She hugged me gently. Her perfume was faint, something floral and clean. My shoulders stiffened before I could stop them. We sat. We talked. We ate. Andrew watched us with the quiet hope of a man who wants the two most important women in his life to love each other. Lily laughed easily, complimented the food, asked thoughtful questions. And every time she laughed, I was no longer in my living room. I was 30 again, standing in a narrow kitchen in a town called Brookhaven, holding a chipped mug while my husband's voice came from behind a closed bedroom door. And then her laugh, soft, familiar, intimate, answered him. I had ignored it then. I wouldn't ignore it now. After dinner, Andrew offered to help with the dishes, but Lily followed me into the kitchen. She moved comfortably, like someone who already belonged there. You've raised Andrew beautifully, she said, drying a plate. He speaks about you with so much respect. Thank you, I replied, watching her hands. Slender fingers. A silver ring on her right hand. Not a wedding band. Yet. Do you ever miss it? She asked suddenly. Miss what? Being young, she said with a smile that felt too knowing. I looked at her then, really looked. The years had touched her too. Lines faint but present. Time leaves marks on all of us. I miss parts of it, I said. But not the confusion. She nodded, as if that answer meant something more than I realized. When they left, the house felt too quiet. I stood at the sink long after the dishes were clean, staring out at the darkening street. I tried to tell myself that voices change, that memory softens over time, that 4 decades was a long stretch. But memory isn't fragile. It's patient. That night, sleep avoided me. The clock on my bedside table ticked steadily, each second heavy. I lay there thinking of the woman I had been before everything broke, before silence became my second language. Back then, my life had been small but full. Brookhaven was the kind of town where neighbors noticed when your lights were off too early. I worked at a local insurance office, wore pressed skirts, believed in routine. My husband, Daniel, came home every evening at 6. We ate dinner together. We talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. Lily had been my friend. She'd arrived in town bright and eager, volunteering at the community center where Daniel sometimes helped. She laughed easily, trusted quickly. I admired that about her. I welcomed her into my home, into my marriage. When I noticed the changes, Daniel staying late, Lily canceling plans, I told myself I was imagining things. Women learn early not to cause trouble, to be understanding, to be quiet. Then came the night I heard that laugh through a closed door. The same one. I stayed married longer than I should have. I stayed silent longer than I should have. When Daniel finally left, Lily left town too. No goodbye. No apology. Just absence. I raised Andrew alone in a different city, a different life. I told myself the past had no place in my present. And then my son brought it back into my living room and called it love. If you're listening and there's a moment in your life you chose not to confront, tell me, did it protect you, or did it wait? The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor. Andrew texted to thank me again. She really likes you, he wrote. I stared at the screen for a long time. Because I knew then what I hadn't wanted to admit the night before. The past doesn't return to ask forgiveness. It returns to demand a choice. The days that followed moved carefully, like they knew better than to rush me. I returned to my routines because they were familiar, and familiarity has a way of keeping panic at bay. I made my tea the same way every morning, waited for the kettle to click off before pouring, stood by the window while steam fogged the glass. Outside, the street carried on. Cars passing, a neighbor dragging bins to the curb, someone laughing 2 houses down. Ordinary sounds. Grounding sounds. Inside me, nothing felt ordinary. Lily's laugh followed me everywhere. It surfaced at the grocery store when a woman behind me chuckled at her phone. It rose unexpectedly from the television during a late-night comedy rerun. Each time, my body reacted before my mind could intervene. A tightening in my chest, a brief loss of breath, a memory pressing forward without asking. Andrew called every other day. Sometimes with purpose, sometimes just to talk. He sounded happy. That was what mattered. Happiness has its own weight when you're a parent. You feel responsible for protecting it, even when you don't know how. One afternoon, he asked if Lily could come by alone. She wants to get to know you better, he said, almost shyly. Just the 2 of you. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. She arrived carrying a small paper bag from a bakery near her apartment. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the room as soon as she stepped inside. I hope this is okay, she said. Andrew mentioned you like sweets. I do, I replied, because honesty felt safer than distance. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table. Without Andrew there, the room felt sharper, quieter. There was no one to soften the edges of what might be said, or not said. You have a beautiful home, she said, looking around. It feels lived in. It should, I said. It's held a lot of years. She smiled softly. Andrew told me you raised him on your own. There it was again. That small, careful statement. Yes, I said. For most of his life. That must have been hard. It was, I said. But it was also clarifying. She tilted her head. Clarifying. When there's no one else to rely on, I said, you learn who you are very quickly. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her cup slowly. Can I ask you something? You already are. She smiled faintly, then grew serious. Do you think people ever truly escape their past? The question settled between us like a fragile object neither of us wanted to touch too roughly. I think, I said carefully, that we carry it differently as we age. Some people face it. Some people run from it. But it always knows where we live. Her eyes dropped. For a moment, she looked younger than she had the night before. Less certain. If this feels familiar to you, if there's a conversation you've avoided because you're afraid of what it might uncover, tell me. Sometimes the questions we don't ask shape our lives more than the ones we do. She stayed longer than she'd planned. We talked about books, about work, about the city. She never mentioned Brookhaven. Never said my old married name. Never acknowledged anything beyond the present. But when she stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. I hope, she said quietly, that one day we can be close. The word close stayed with me long after she left. That night, I opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were pieces of another life. Photographs, folded letters, a pressed flower that had lost its color but not its shape. At the bottom was a photograph of Daniel and me on our wedding day. Young. Certain. Smiling like people who didn't yet understand how easily certainty can fracture. I turned the photo over. In familiar handwriting were the words, "I never meant for it to happen this way." My hands trembled. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the photograph until the past felt close enough to breathe. A few days later, Andrew invited me to lunch. A small cafe near his office. The kind with chipped mugs and low music humming beneath conversation. Lily was already there when I arrived. She stood and hugged me. Warm. Careful. Andrew watched us closely, hope written all over his face. Lunch passed easily. Too easily. Until Andrew stepped outside to take a call. Lily leaned forward. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I." She hesitated. "Andrew mentioned your husband passed away years ago." "Yes. I'm sorry." I studied her face. "Thank you." Her gaze flickered. Just for a second. "He must have meant a great deal to you." "He did," I said. "Once." When Andrew returned, the conversation shifted back to lighter things. Laughter. Plans. From the outside, we looked like any family standing at the edge of a new beginning. But on the walk home, certainty settled into my bones. She remembered. Not fully, perhaps. Not immediately. But enough to avoid the truth. That evening, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I searched for Daniel. It took less time than I expected. People leave traces, old addresses, business listings, photographs tucked into forgotten corners of the internet. I found him in another city. Older. Grayer. And beside him, in a photo taken only a few years earlier, stood Lily. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. I closed the laptop and sat back, the room suddenly very still. So it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't memory playing tricks. The past hadn't ended 40 years ago. It had simply waited. By morning, one thing was clear. I could not remain silent again. But before I spoke to my son, I needed to hear the truth from her. And I needed to hear it without witnesses. I invited Lily over the following Sunday afternoon, telling her I needed help sorting through some boxes upstairs. The excuse sounded harmless enough. Domestic. Ordinary. She agreed without hesitation. The hallway upstairs smelled faintly of lavender polish and old wood. I keep it that way on purpose. Some scents make a home feel steady, like nothing truly bad can happen inside them. Lily followed me quietly, her footsteps light against the floor. As we passed the framed photographs along the wall, I noticed her eyes slow. She stopped at one picture longer than the others. Andrew at 4 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, sitting on a man's shoulders. Daniel's shoulders. His hands gripping his father's hair, laughing like the world was safe. Lily's smile didn't disappear, but something in her posture changed. A tightening. A pause she didn't seem aware of. "This way," I said gently. The attic stairs were narrow and steep. I went first, my hand gliding along the railing, feeling the familiar grooves worn down by years of use. Lily followed carefully. When we reached the top, she let out a small breath and laughed, quietly, as if relieved. That laugh. The attic light flickered once before settling. Boxes lined the walls, labeled in my handwriting. Old furniture draped in sheets. A trunk that had belonged to my grandmother. Memories stacked neatly, waiting. "I've been organizing," I said, opening a box marked photos. The smell of old paper rose instantly, dry and faintly sweet. "I like to do it when the weather turns." Lily nodded. "That makes sense." I lifted out an album and began turning pages slowly. Andrew as a baby. Andrew on his first day of school. Andrew standing proudly beside a bicycle he'd saved up for himself. Safe years. Years after. Then I turned to the page I had chosen. Daniel looked younger there. Less complicated. His arm was around me, my hand resting on his chest like it belonged there forever. Lily went very still. "That's my husband," I said quietly. "Andrew's father." Her breath caught. "Just once. Enough." "He looks kind," she said, her voice unsteady. "He was," I replied. She lowered herself onto an old trunk, hands folding together in her lap. "I didn't recognize you," she said quickly. "Not at first. But you recognize him," I said. She nodded, tears already gathering. "Yes." The attic hummed with quiet. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Life. Unconcerned. "I didn't know Andrew was your son when I met him," she said. "He used his middle name. He never talked about his father. I swear it." "And when you realized?" I asked. Her shoulders sagged. "By then, I loved him. Love again. Always love." "Does he know?" I asked. "No," she said immediately. "Please. Don't tell him." I closed the album carefully, resting it on my knees. My hands were steady, though my heart was not. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it." She spoke then. About Brookhaven. About believing Daniel when he said our marriage was already dying. About leaving town instead of apologizing. About finding him years later in another city and trying, failing, to build something lasting. "He died 6 years ago," she said softly. I already knew. Hearing it still felt final in a way memory never does. "When I met Andrew," she continued, "it felt like fate. Like life was offering me something gentler. A second chance," I said. She nodded. "Yes." I looked at her. Really looked. She wasn't the same woman who had once laughed behind a closed door. Time had shaped her too. Regret had left its marks. But regret doesn't erase consequence. If you're listening to this, I want to ask you something. Do you believe a second chance is still a gift if it's built on silence? Tell me what you think. Lily reached for my hand, then stopped herself. "I never meant to hurt you again," she whispered. "But you did," I said. "Not cruelly. Just honestly." She nodded, tears slipping free. "I know." We went downstairs together, the house suddenly feeling too tidy, too calm for what had just been said. At the bottom of the stairs, she turned to me, her voice shaking. "Please," she said. "He doesn't deserve to be hurt." I met her eyes. Neither did I. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the hallway, my bare feet whispering against the floorboards. I thought about the years I'd spent protecting my son from pain. I thought about the price of silence. By morning, the decision had begun to take shape. When Andrew called later that day, his voice cheerful and unaware, I felt something settle inside me, heavy but certain. I could protect his happiness for now, or I could protect his future. And for the first time in my life, I knew silence was no longer an option. I didn't tell Andrew right away. That choice followed me through the house like a shadow that lengthened as the day wore on. I made myself lunch and forgot to eat it. I wiped down counters that were already clean. I folded laundry slowly, carefully, as if order might spill into my thoughts if I handled enough small things just right. Silence has a way of pretending its kindness. By evening, my head ached with it. Andrew called just after dinner. "Mom," he said, his voice easy. "Lily told me you two spent the afternoon together." "We did," I replied. She seemed quiet afterward. "So was I." There was a pause on the line. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. "Is everything okay?" I closed my eyes. The question was gentle, trusting, and it deserved more than a half-truth. "Not simple," I said finally. "But we should talk." We met the next afternoon at a small park not far from my house. The benches were worn smooth, the paths familiar. This was where Andrew learned to ride his bike, where I once pretended not to watch while he wobbled forward, determined and fearless. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. We walked first, side by side, leaves crunching beneath our feet. He talked about work, about wedding plans he and Lily had slowed down on, about how unsettled he felt without knowing why. "It feels like I'm missing something," he admitted. "Like there's a piece of the story I don't have." I stopped walking. "Andrew," I said quietly, "there is." He turned toward me, concern crossing his face. "What is it?" I took a breath. One. Then another. I told myself I would speak calmly, without accusation, without dramatics. Just truth, placed carefully between us. I told him about Brookhaven, about his father, about the woman who had once been my closest friend. I told him about the laugh I heard through a closed door and the years of silence that followed. I told him that Lily hadn't entered his life by coincidence, but not by intention either. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He listened the way he used to as a child when something truly mattered, his face open, his hands still. When I finished, the park felt impossibly quiet. "So she knew," he said at last. "Not a question." "Yes." "And she didn't tell me." "No." He nodded slowly, fitting the truth together piece by piece. "I love her," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied. He looked at me then, really looked, and asked the question that hurt most. "Do you think she loves me?" I didn't answer immediately. I wanted to be honest without being cruel. "Yes," I said finally. "I believe she does." He swallowed hard. "Then why does this feel like betrayal?" "Because love doesn't erase history. Because truth changes the shape of things. Because silence, even when meant kindly, still robs people of choice." I didn't say those words. He needed to reach them on his own. I need time, he said. And space. Take all of it, I told him. He hugged me before he left, holding on longer than usual. As I watched him walk away, I felt relief and grief settle together in my chest. Telling the truth hadn't freed me completely, but it had unburdened me. The days that followed were quiet in a new way. Lily called once. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short, mostly silence filled with breathing. I never wanted to put you in this position, she said softly. I hope one day you'll understand. I deleted the message, not out of anger, but because I wasn't ready to carry her voice again. Word traveled, as it always does. A postponed wedding. Plans on hold. People filled the gaps with their own stories. I let them. If you've ever watched your private pain turn into public curiosity, tell me, did you explain yourself, or did you let people believe what they needed to? Andrew came by one evening without calling ahead. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where he once did homework, his shoulders slumped. I talked to her, he said. I waited. She told me everything, he continued. More than I expected. About my father. About why she didn't speak. And how do you feel? I asked. He stared at the table for a long moment. I don't know if I can marry her, he said quietly. Not now. Maybe not ever. I reached across and took his hand. Whatever you choose, I said, make sure it's your choice. Not mine. Not hers. He nodded, his grip tightening briefly around my fingers. We ate dinner together that night. Quietly. Comfortably. When he left, he hugged me again. I don't blame you, he said softly. For any of it. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let the weight of decades lift just a little. The truth had cost me peace once. This time, it felt different. This time, it felt like dignity. After Andrew and Lily decided to step back from the wedding, life didn't rush in to fill the space the way people expect it to. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden relief. What came instead was something quieter and more difficult, a long stretch of adjustment where every day felt slightly off balance. Andrew called less often at first. Not because he was angry, but because he was learning how to sit with disappointment without leaning on anyone else. I recognized that kind of distance. I had lived inside it for years. When he did call, his voice sounded older, more careful, as if every word had to pass through thought before it reached his mouth. I keep replaying things, he admitted one afternoon. Moments that felt real. Conversations I trusted. That's normal, I told him. When the ground shifts, you look down to see where it cracked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a soft, tired laugh. You always know how to say it. I didn't tell him that wisdom is often just pain that learned how to speak gently. Lily moved out of the apartment they had shared. She took a position in another city, not far enough to feel like running, but far enough to give Andrew room to breathe. That detail mattered to me. It told me she wasn't trying to erase herself, only to stop causing harm. We didn't speak again. Not by phone. Not by letter. And strangely, that felt right. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive as a conversation. Sometimes it's simply the decision not to keep carrying someone else's weight. The house felt larger during those weeks. Not empty. Just quieter. I cooked smaller meals. I read books I'd put off for years. I walked longer routes through the neighborhood, letting my legs decide where we went. Autumn settled in gently, the air crisp, the leaves whispering underfoot. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found an old scarf I hadn't worn in decades. It smelled faintly of cedar and something sweeter beneath it. Perfume, maybe, from a life that once belonged to me. I pressed it to my face and felt tears come without warning. Not for Daniel. Not for Lily. For the woman I had been before silence felt safer than truth. If you're listening and you've ever mourned a version of yourself that didn't get to fully exist, tell me in the comments. I think more of us carry that grief than we admit. Andrew came by one evening with a bottle of wine and an uncertain smile. I thought we could cook together, he said. Like we used to. We stood side by side in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, bumping elbows, falling back into an old rhythm. The sizzle of onions in the pan filled the room, grounding us in the present. I don't regret loving her, he said quietly. But I do regret not knowing everything sooner. I nodded. Love isn't wrong, I said. Even when it ends. He glanced at me. Do you regret staying quiet all those years ago? The question settled heavily between us. Yes, I said after a moment. And no. He waited. I regret the loneliness it caused me, I continued. But I don't regret protecting you when you were young. What I regret most is believing silence was the only option. He nodded slowly. I don't want to live that way. I know, I said. And you don't have to. That night, after he left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done. The house was still, but the stillness no longer felt oppressive. It felt honest. Weeks turned into months. Andrew began to sound lighter on the phone. He laughed more easily. He made plans that didn't circle around what might have been. One Sunday morning, he surprised me with breakfast. He moved confidently around my kitchen now, like someone who had reclaimed his footing. I've been thinking, he said, setting a plate in front of me, about how close I came to building my future on something incomplete. I met his eyes. And what did you decide? That I want a life built on truth, he said. Even when it's uncomfortable. Something in my chest loosened then. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Later that day, after he left, I took out the old photo album again. I didn't open it. I simply held it for a moment, acknowledging the weight of it, and then placed it back in its box. Some stories don't need to be revisited to be honored. As I sit here now, the light outside my window soft and forgiving, I think about how differently this ending feels from the one I once imagined. There was no victory. No punishment. Just honesty, finally spoken, and the quiet dignity of choosing differently the second time around. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to ask you, when the moment came to choose between peace and honesty, which one did you choose? Time did what it always does when you finally stop fighting it. It softened the sharpest edges first. The house began to feel like mine again, not a place holding its breath. Mornings returned to their quiet rhythm. I made my tea, stood by the window, watched the same sparrows argue over the same patch of fence. Small, ordinary things resumed their importance. And in that ordinariness, I felt myself settling. Andrew started visiting more often. Not with the heaviness he'd carried in those first weeks, but with ease. He would stop by after work, loosen his tie, open the refrigerator without asking. We talked about books, about his job, about the neighbor's terrible parking. Laughter returned, easy, unguarded laughter that didn't carry ghosts with it. One evening, as we cleared the table together, he mentioned Lily again. I ran into her, he said quietly. My hands paused mid-motion, then continued. How was she? Different, he said after a moment. Calmer. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing heavy. And how did that feel? He leaned against the counter, thinking. Like closure, he said. Not forgiveness exactly. Just understanding. I nodded. That sounded right. I told her I hoped she found peace, he added. And I meant it. So did I realized, without effort, without forcing the feeling. A few days later, a letter arrived addressed to me in handwriting I recognized instantly. Lily's. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it slowly, the paper smooth beneath my fingers. She didn't explain herself. She didn't defend her choices. She thanked me for telling the truth she couldn't bring herself to say, for giving Andrew the chance to choose with open eyes, for not turning pain into cruelty. I am learning, she wrote, that accountability can be a kind of freedom. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Not as a keepsake. As a marker. A reminder of where the story had turned. If you're listening and wondering whether accountability ever brings peace, tell me, have you experienced that in your own life? Life continued, as it always does. I joined a small book club at the library, the same place I'd once worked as a younger woman, breathing in the familiar scent of paper and dust. I made a friend named Ruth who talked too much and laughed too loudly and brought homemade biscuits every week. I volunteered again, shelving books, remembering how steady my hands still were. There were moments, of course, when memory tapped at my shoulder. A street that looked like Brookhaven. A song on the radio that carried me backward. But the memories no longer demanded anything from me. They were simply facts of a life fully lived. One afternoon, while sorting old paperwork, I found my marriage certificate. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. I studied the names, mine and Daniel's, written as if they belonged together forever. I didn't feel anger. I felt gratitude for having survived the ending. I tore the paper carefully and placed it in the recycling bin. Not out of bitterness. Out of release. Andrew called that evening. I met someone, he said, cautious but hopeful. I smiled into the phone. Tell me about her. She's kind, he said. And honest. She asks difficult questions. That's a good sign, I replied. He hesitated. I told her everything. About Lily. About the past. And she thanked me, he said, sounding almost surprised, for trusting her with the truth. My eyes filled then, not with sadness, but with relief. We ended the call laughing. The kind of laughter that doesn't echo. As I sit here now, the evening light soft against the walls, I think about the woman I was at 30, the one who heard a laugh behind a closed door and chose silence. I don't judge her anymore. She did the best she could with what she knew. But if I could speak to her now, I would tell her this. Silence doesn't protect love. It only delays the cost. Truth, spoken with care, is what gives people the chance to choose their lives honestly. And if you've stayed with me until the end, I want to ask you something. If you were me, would you have made the same choice? And what truth might you be holding right now, waiting for the courage to speak? I've told this story slowly because it took me a lifetime to understand it. At 71, I no longer confuse silence with strength. I once believed keeping quiet made me kind, made me patient, made me a good wife and an even better mother. What it really did was teach me how to disappear inside my own life. I don't say that with bitterness now. I say it with clarity. Time has a way of softening judgment. I don't hate the woman I once was, and I don't hate the woman who hurt me either. Age teaches you that most people are not villains, just frightened, unfinished humans making choices they don't fully understand. What I do know is this: truth does not arrive to destroy you. It arrives to ask you who you want to be next. My son is building a life grounded in honesty, and that is something silence could never have given him. As for me, I wake up lighter these days. The house feels like mine again. My voice does too. If you're listening to this and carrying a truth you've buried for years, I won't tell you what to do. Wisdom doesn't shout. It sits beside you and waits. But I will ask you this, gently, honestly. If you were me, would you have made the same choice? And if you could sit across from your younger self right now, what truth would you finally tell them? If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, or name one person in your life who shaped you more than they ever knew. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, told slowly and honestly, I hope you'll stay with me. Some truths take decades to speak, but it's never too late to begin.